Hello and welcome to Working Historians, a podcast series where we discuss what historians do with their lives. I am Rob Denning, Associate Dean for Liberal Arts for Southern New Hampshire University's online history programs. About a year ago, we held a History Speaker Series event with Dr. Matt Schandler where we talked a bit about the introduction of artificial intelligence into the study of history. Today, Matt is joining us again, and we're going to talk a bit about new developments in AI and possibly talk a little bit about what's in the future. But most importantly, we're going to talk about why should people pursue history degrees when AI seems to be perfectly capable of doing a lot of really cool stuff. Come join us. So, hello, everybody. For tonight's history speaker event, I am speaking with Dr. Matt Schandler, who teaches at SNHU and a variety of other universities. Before we get started, I'm going to introduce Matt, and then Matt is going to get into the subject of artificial intelligence and how historians use it and what we should be looking for going forward with research and with life in general, I suppose. So, Matt began studying game-playing artificial intelligence programs as an early graduate student. Despite a continued personal interest, we entered into a long AI winter, but with the coming of OpenAI's breakthroughs in 2022, a new chance to participate in AI research and policy emerged. With these changes, Matt took on consulting work, focusing on developing domain-level expertise for generative AI models. He continues to teach courses on the history of technology and technology policy. He also runs the Data Studies for the Social Good program at Chestnut Hill College, which aims to align with the United Nations AI for Good initiative. So, Matt, can you introduce yourself and fill us in on where we've been?
Yeah, sure. Hey, Rob. Good to see you again, or hear you again. Well, to be quite honest, a lot has changed since the last time we did talk, and some of it's for the better and some of it's for the worse. Now, when we did talk last session, we really were looking at I don't want to mean this in a negative way, but very basic prompting techniques to get going. Since then, what constitutes, for example, being a beginner has shifted dramatically. And that is very much in part due to the rapid pace of technological advancement, which, as you well know, means progress for some, not for all. And what I'm finding increasingly is a gradual awareness that's a little behind the curve. And there was, for example, a lot of news about a tool Anthropic developed called Mythos, which effectively could exploit known and unknown vulnerabilities in code in systems globally. So the risks existentially for AI have increased significantly, but the ability for AI to help us in our daily life has also increased significantly. So we have what is, in many respects, a typical acceleration, but a very typical problem in the history of technology. And that, of course, is how do we deal with change over time? How do we deal with the exploitative effects of a new technological concept and its rapid deployment? So, for instance, we have major national security imperatives that are more pressing than ever before. The disinformation crisis is more pressing than ever before. We see a lot about energy use, data centers, and environmental concerns. We see a widening of the digital divide and a deepening of the digital divide. There are, again, not unfamiliar to the historian, concerns about technological unemployment, but lingering questions as to whether or not these will manifest in any true sense. We're starting to see layoffs. Now, whether or not these layoffs translate into larger patterns in disciplines like history are yet to be seen. However, what I would note is a bit of optimism. And initially, my optimism had actually been pessimism. And what I'm seeing more and more, and I think a lot of people are seeing more and more, are actually the limits of generative AI as we have it now. AI can summarize a 500-page book. It can write an essay. It could write a dissertation. but is it good? Is it creative? Is it original? And the answer to those questions almost universally is no. It's usually synthetic and oftentimes derivative and reaching for a form of what we might consider to be sycophancy. The model wants to tell you that you're brilliant, that you're terrific, that you're a genius, when you're essentially asking what would be a rather typical question for the historian. But what I'm finding since the academic semester just ended is that question here. It's an existential one, and it applies to history and it applies to every discipline, is if the language model can do those things for me, why would I pay tuition? Why would I spend 20 hours in the library? Why would I bother when the machine can think for me? And I think the problem is that conflation belief that the machine is actually thinking. They're still not thinking. They're still not intelligent. But they're showing flashes of what we might see in the future. And what they're missing and what they will continue to miss is critical empathy, creativity, and the complex, nuanced critical thinking skills that a human possesses. So that's where we are right now as an overview, I suppose.
I don't know. I've been really kind of spreading the word about the American Historical Association's guidelines on the use of AI in the history profession and all of that. And that goes along with what you're saying here, is that AI, as you say, is really good at analyzing big data sets. It's good at synthesizing large, big books. It's good at summarizing things. But the thing that it can't do, of course, is it can't produce anything that's new. It's because all it's doing is it's regurgitating the stuff that's been fed into it. So it can synthesize the stuff that's already been done, but it doesn't move beyond that. And so and that's going to be kind of the basis of what we're talking about here tonight. But I suppose that's kind of a starting point, is that we've got the question of why bother going and getting a history degree if AI can do a lot of this work for us? Well, there is stuff that we could that it can't do for us. And so we've got so you mentioned in the notes that you provided for me for this meeting here, you've got a couple of examples here about some traps and some models that you were working on. So why don't you tell us about what we can use AI for?
One of the things I was considering in terms of those AHA guidelines, and I did actually include some of that information again to you. You actually originally shared those with me. I guess that was 2025. And we took a look at those together. And in many ways, that helped shape SNHU's history program's policy towards AI. But one of the things that I did find helpful is the fact that the AHA offers a permissibility framework. And speaking of synthesis, speaking of using tools like Notebook LM, is it permissible to have the model summarize for you and you don't read it at all? No, it's not. But if you're struggling with a complex text, like, I don't know, just looking at my bookshelf, In Defense of History by Richard J. Evans, that's a hard book, and if you read it and you ask some questions to a language model or, a system like a RAG system like Notebook LM, that's permissible. So it's a tool that augments. It doesn't automate, it doesn't replace, it augments what we're capable of as humans. And, I was thinking a lot about writing a dissertation in the era of mainstream generative AI. And I think it's possible to produce scholarship that's better than ever before because of those newer approaches to prompting. And those newer approaches to prompting get beyond a static data set, and they help reduce in some situations hallucinations and fabrication of information. In other cases, it actually increases the likelihood of that happening. But I do feel that we are seeing people who are capable and literate using AI jumping ahead of people who are incapable or unwilling to utilize AI. And one of the things I noted with some understanding and frustration, consternation at once, I was giving a seminar to faculty, history faculty at a small liberal arts college, not the school I work at. And it was at the beginning of the school year. And obviously, I started with something along the lines of, what are your major gripes with AI? Are you using AI in the class? And universally, the entire room says I refuse to use AI. And I told them, you're too far behind now to catch up, most likely. How does that make you feel? And it made them feel as if they were lost forever. And we're at that precipice, I think. We're at that turning point where if you're not at least capable of prompting to get exactly what you want from a model in a basic sense, you are too far behind and you need to really get caught up. However, it's also not realistic, for example, for your average academic or your average run of the mill individual to spend as much time working with language models as, say, I do. And that's also part of the problem with technological literacy these days, is it does require such intense effort and such commitment to learning that it does restrict and it does create a barrier to entry that is very steep and very costly. And I don't just mean financially, but I also do mean financially, because having access to the models that I have access to, they're hundreds of dollars a month. If you totaled all of my subscriptions, luckily I get subsidized. We're talking now $300 and $400 a month, and that price is pretty standard across the board at this point. So I have found that AI makes my life easier, but I also find that AI is a bit of a crutch at times. And I do find myself taking shortcuts. And I do think students, for example, find themselves taking shortcuts. And, one of the things I see a lot, again, speaking of the end of the academic year, finals, it's the night before your final paper is due. ChatGPT is open on your screen. The cursor is blinking. It's tempting you. Come talk to me. Come ask me the question. And how do you resist that? It's plausible, structured, and authoritative text. Just this once, I'll do it. Just this once. And yeah, it is kind of that like forbidden fruit. Once you take a bite, it might be it. However, if this does mean future employment prospects are constrained so significantly, if you don't take that bite, I don't know what to tell people, and I can't tell people what to do because of all those problems that I had highlighted: the labor exploitation, the environmentalism, the security concerns. And I just mentioned Mythos as an example, but we thought in many respects that the things that Mythos is capable of doing would not really be possible until the quantum computing era began in earnest, and that is no longer the case. We've hit that now. The Canvas hack last week was not quite what we're talking about. But again, just to give a staggering, terrifying example, not singling out Anthropic. I actually think Anthropic's one of the most safety-oriented companies in the world. But there was a hack that was partially, if not about half, fully automated. I know that didn't make sense. Around half automation using AI agents that got into Anthropic systems. And that was done by AI agents, not necessarily even human beings. So the machines are actually a threat now. And how do we proceed when there's no regulation? And in the policy realm, it's dangerous to regulate. And the typical argument is that it stifles innovation. And sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. But no regulations whatsoever, or regulations that are so heavy-handed and misapplied, we don't have any good answers here. And that's, to me, actually more scary than the prospects of technological unemployment, because I'm not sure those are going to manifest in the way that most people are fearful of. But I also do fully understand why that is the case, because we are seeing at least some token examples of technological unemployment from AI being deployed at corporations and other places. So, there's a lot of different directions to go in here. I do think that it's exciting, but I also think that tempering our expectations and making sure that we are proceeding carefully is paramount. However, we're also in a Cold War with China, and we do have to keep pace with China, and slowing down means losing that race. So this is a very complicated policy landscape that there are no good answers that I can give, unfortunately, at this time. And that's frustrating, especially because I like having answers, right? So that's kind of where we're at in one place anyway.
Well, yeah, and so it's hard to tell people that we kind of have to wait and see, and I think that's kind of basically where we are, is that on for our policies and all of that, and because it's uh, we don't know, and because too little regulation, too much regulation, finding that balance is going to be a trial and error type thing, and so it's going to take time for that to play out, and so that it is hard to tell people, give it time, and we got to see how it shakes out, because yeah, in the meantime people are terrified about losing their jobs and all of that stuff that you just mentioned, and so that is nerve-wracking. um so let's see, so going back to this, the question about, why should I be in, why bother pursue a history degree, if all this stuff is happening, given the fact that who knows what the job market's going to look like, given that, the student on the next terminal over from me is churning stuff out in seconds that it takes me hours of agonizing to do. So what more do you have to say on why bother?
I think that there's a broader pattern that the mainstreaming of generative AI, again, between 2017 and 2022, that's really the time where we saw this massive acceleration. That's between the Transformer and OpenAI's breakthroughs. So, we had, on the one hand, one of the largest companies in the world, and then an upstart, which I'm sure, if some of you have been following that trial in Oakland, Sam Altman and Elon Musk going back and forth. I have to acknowledge that the boom came in a period of time that I did notice as a teacher a reduction in critical thinking willingness. I don't know if it's a skill atrophy, but it is a willingness. And in part, yes, that is due to external distractions. But what I saw, for instance, say 2012, 2013, I could have a student in one of my survey courses read 25, 30 pages. They wouldn't want to, but they would do it. In 2026, I assign 30 pages, it's not getting read.
Yeah.
And it's not even getting dropped into a notebook LM for summary. That step isn't even being taken. So it's not an AI thing. It's not a social media thing. It's not a late stage capitalism thing. It's all of those things. And it's other things that I am not sure I can diagnose. But it is a confluence of factors that is making it, as I see it anyway, more important than ever before to hone and keep sharp critical thinking skills, the ability yourself to synthesize and retain information. And I do think that we have gotten to a point where we're kind of like this lookup culture where it's no longer really a committed to memory thing. It's hold on, let's look that up really quickly. And yeah, that's nice. It settles arguments rather fast, but it does mean that we're not exercising our minds. And when we don't exercise our minds, like anything else, it does lose its sharpness. And I, I don't think it's any particular individual. It's a bigger problem than any one person, any one institution. But I do wonder, why are we effectively sick as a nation and as a world? And how can AI get us out of this? And is that possible? Or is AI worsening this problem? And at this point, I'm actually seeing a bit of both. I'm seeing students, for example, who leverage AI and are writing some of the best stuff I've ever seen them churn out. And then I'm seeing the students who just copy and paste straight away, sometimes not even removing the language that says, your professor will really like this. Make sure you include this quote. It happens so often, I can't even begin to tell you. But what was really funny, Rob, and I meant to email you this, and I didn't because I knew we'd be talking sometime soon. A student, and I actually asked if I could tell you this. So FERPA still is a very big thing, everybody, in the age of AI. Don't forget that. They were in my class and they prompted a model. I believe it was probably Gemini, to come up with sources that I would like as their teacher. Lo and behold, they started their paper with, on Rob Denning's podcast, Working Historians, Dr. Denning interviewed, blah, 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 blah. So we get that model sycophancy right away. And not only is it targeting what the student wanted, it's actually finding information that matches, in this case, to me, which is then to try to, by extension, please me through that process. So I thought that was one of the weirdest and most glaringly clear AI issues I've ever noted in my life. But I thought it was very interesting to see how the model attempted to please the student and the teacher at the same time. But I'm also seeing a lot of the other stuff where it's like, leave this in, leaving this quote in from the model. It's like, hallucinated citations, fabricated citations, papers that are 5 pages long with a monograph list of 10, which would total something like, 4,000 pages of books. When again, I couldn't get that same student to read maybe 100 pages throughout the whole semester. So, we talk more and more about AI detection tools in academia and how that's going to help, save the degree and save the integrity of institutions. But what's actually happening is those people who are fluent in AI, language models that should be clear, we see the patterns. We see what's evident. Like, for example, a very common pattern, it's not X, it's Y with a semicolon. Semicolon use is often misused anyway in the English language. And those patterns become so glaring. And no matter what model you use, those patterns are still evident. So, is the degree still worth it to kind of get back on track here? I actually think it's more imperative than it ever has been, because what we are seeing is those workers who will survive the AI purge, the great AI purge, if it comes, they will be the most skilled. They will be the most demonstrative of critical thinking skills. And I think having the ability not just to be intelligent and demonstrate that, because some of that's innate, right? Some of that's not learned, but rapid recall, making connections on your own, being an interesting individual to talk to. That's always the thing. Now, I was always told as a graduate student, learn this stuff so you'll be interesting to talk to at a cocktail party. And I think I've mentioned these before. I've probably been to 3 cocktail parties in my whole adult life. So I honestly don't know if I'm interesting at all or not. But it really has become a case of just relying on everything but our own minds. And I think that speaks to a bigger problem that AI is exacerbating. But I think that being honest and pursuing a degree in something like history and philosophy, two areas that are often, maligned because we push so much on STEM, and I understand why. Those are actually coming back around to being to mattering because of the need for, say, abstract thinking, the ability to make connections, the ability to synthesize text in a way that is original and not just creating a false consensus. So I'm also seeing that in many areas of emerging employment, subject matter expertise is significantly valued, and some jobs are actually only going to be available to those who have the credentials still. Now, that does create the divisions in our society and culture, and those are problematic. But again, more than ever before, we do have access to educational platforms like through schools like SNHU that didn't exist before. At the same time, a lot of people are pursuing degrees, and the pursuit of that degree might not go where they want because they didn't take school seriously. So, is AI killing education? No, I don't think it is at all. But I think it's making it so students are going to get through with the C or the B and really not be able to do much at all with their degree at all. And I think that's a pity. And I think that's a loss. And I think that, is almost an emerging tragedy, not to be hyperbolic, but I do have major concerns about that as a teacher and as someone who, engages in policy analysis and the like. So I think more than ever, yes, I think
I
the degree
wonder,
matters.
this may be drifting a little bit, but
It's all right.
we'll call it a fidelity hallucination on my part or something. But we could, I'm curious, because I've been telling students for 15 years now, or however long I've been doing this, that history students, with the advent of Wikipedia and, the internet, basically, it's not really our job to memorize facts anymore. We don't have to memorize the date that Washington invaded the Ohio country and sparked the 7 Years' War. We kind of outsourced that. But the thing that we can't outsource is the thinking, the organizing thoughts, and bringing that raw data, which is stored in Wikipedia or wherever, bringing it together and telling a story with it and trying to make sense of it and try to explain why things happen the way they did. And so, in a way, historians, and I guess to a larger extent, a lot of humanities fields, have been kind of doing that for a while now. And so I'm wondering if it's just kind of occurring to me, and this kind of like a half-baked thought, so maybe this isn't going to go anywhere, but I wonder if that's one of the reasons that humanities type thinkers are possibly going to be okay here, because we've already trained ourselves to do the stuff that AI can't really do as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because in that way, AI can put together kind of it can write a really good Wikipedia article, but again, that's just kind of the raw data of history. It's not really making a coherent argument about the human condition, which is what historians and other liberal arts folks have been doing, which is perhaps one of the things that's kind of one of the silver linings, is that in a way, we've been kind of preparing for this for decades at this point. And so it's not as sudden. It may seem terrifying to a professor who's looking down the barrel of 15 students that turned in an AI paper, but at the same time, as an existential threat to the discipline, maybe not so much. I don't know what you think about that.
I think about it a lot, and one point that I remember when we first discussed AI, you and I, generative AI, I should say. You had mentioned actually the slide rule, and I think you had actually mentioned something along the lines of, the wiki movement. And again, the scientific calculator did not put engineers out of work.
Right.
These are, these examples are given often. Is this different? In in a number of ways, yes, it is different because what's going to come. But in its current state, as in 2026, what is it? May 2026.
Something like
Uh,
that.
we have some problems still. So I did bring some statistics, data points for you. Um, I don't like calling out any particular companies. So let's say I'm going to have to, but between 20 and 60% of those. Are you familiar with those cards that you get from a web search? It could be Google, it could be Copilot, it could be Perplexity, it could be Consensus. It gives you a summary. Duck AI does it too, but that's based upon Bing results. I'm pretty sure. Don't quote me on that. I'm pretty sure it still is though. But Perplexity performed the best, and it was still hallucinating 34% of the time. And what happens in those instances is when you ask, "Are you sure?" It'll say definitely, certainly, undoubtedly, and that's a huge problem. It's a huge problem in a world where people do that anyway, right? People double down when they're wrong and they refuse to acknowledge that they're incorrect. They won't learn. There's a lack of humility. There's a lack of epistemological humility. And I'm not a psychologist, but it feels like we're living in a world where the Dunning-Kruger effect is just running rampant. People are just, I'm so confident. I know what I'm talking about. I know what I'm talking about. And another study I was reading, just to get ready to talk to you, in legal journals, let me get the stat correct so I don't hallucinate myself. AI performance is a 2024 Stanford study. 69 to 88% fabrication rate for citations. I should correct myself. It's actually hallucination rate for citations, not fabrication rate. So fabrication would mean making them up completely. Hallucination would mean some type of combination of things that actually might exist. So, for example, an author, but attributing an article that doesn't exist to that author, that would be a hallucination. A fabrication would be like John S. Historian, and history's greatest mysteries or something. It doesn't exist as a book, right?
And that's
So
69 to 88% are
yes, for citations.
Holy
For
crap.
citations. So you have to check them. Now,
Yeah.
again, if you go through and you do check them, you'll be able to fix them if you're knowledgeable of the profession. But if you're not, you won't know those authors and you won't know how to go back and fix those without prompting, and asking, check again, check again, check again.
Yep.
And even when you go check again, check again, check again, it doubles down, it doubles down, it doubles down and saying, yes, I'm right. Yes, I'm right. And then you finally say you're wrong. And it says, oh my gosh, you're right. The whole thing. And this reminds me also, I got a chainsaw. I had a tree fall on my property and I had to fix it. I never owned a chainsaw before. It's pretty fun. Be safe out there. But it broke. And, I'm asking Gemini, hey, how do I fix my chainsaw? And he's like, it's so easy. Just took this thing in here and here. And I'm like, it doesn't exist on my model. And it's like, absolutely it does. Here's a picture of it, right? So it shows me my chainsaw, but it invented the hole where it didn't exist, right? So it's like, oh my gosh. But in terms of history and in terms of, getting back to that point, if you know your stuff, you can make best use of a model output. But where it's not doing a great job is something that I might call historiographical flattening. And what I'm seeing happen is AI doesn't really like tension in output. It likes to resolve the tension. So it reaches towards consensus. And when it reaches towards consensus, it's not actually a human-generated consensus on a controversial topic. It's kind of a bland, avoid the controversy. But again, if you know how to prompt, you can tease that language model to give you more of the nuance and more of that flair. Another thing that I'm seeing models not do a great job on and there's a lot of these examples, but anachronistic thinking. So we often teach and discuss the tension between presentism and relativism. And what we often do see happen with language models is sometimes a bit of both, but more so presentism. So, for instance, I was working with some data about 17th century New England and Puritan diaries. And what the model kept saying was this was psychological trauma. Psychological trauma. They were traumatized by this. Now, they very well might have been traumatized by it, but that idea of trauma and the traumatic effect, that would not have been necessarily familiar to someone living in 17th century, Massachusetts area. So, between the hallucinations and fabrications, I don't love the word hallucination. I never have. Historiographical flattening, anachronistic thinking, and it seems, why don't we just get rid of this all? And you had brought up the AHA, and I think the AHA's guidelines are actually quite good. I think they could be improved in a few places, but guess what? Everybody has their opinions.
Yep.
But they say, banning AI is just going to make it more of that forbidden fruit that I talked about before. So what I've kind of adopted as my own mantra of sorts is augmenting, not automating. So augmentation of our capabilities and enhancing the output using our own human, and I guess for that matter, humanistic impulses, and not relying on, say, an agent to do all our research for us. And, even JSTOR now, which is actually quite helpful, it has that research assistant built in. I think it's still in beta, I'm pretty sure, but it's pretty darn accurate. And what I found it does for me is reduce my time on JSTOR by, say, 20 to 30%. However, it is cultivating articles based upon what it thinks I want, not necessarily based upon what I want. So with all of these changes happening, and we're trying to teach these concepts to students that are already difficult to teach. Historiographical analysis is probably the hardest thing historians do. When we're dealing with models that sometimes, I'm not making a blanket, universal statement here, but sometimes we'll go through this process of, again, taking things and evening them out for the purpose of offering a concise response. It's in that concise response that we're losing the nuance that makes history so fun. And it's also where it makes history so difficult and also so controversial. And, in an era where history is being flattened due to external politics, more than ever, I also think that historians have to be aware, cognizant of the fact that we have a significant obligation to the truth and to the facts. And if we're relying on something that might be incorrect and not even bothering to check it, we're not doing our due diligence, and we're actually doing our country a disservice, and we're doing our discipline and our profession a disservice.
I was curious. I actually have not spent much time with the research bot, whatever you want to call it, on JSTOR. Is that system, is that bot only referencing the articles that are in JSTOR?
In JSTOR.
Is it basically just a massive notebook LLM type situation?
Yeah. Okay. So the way that I would describe it to you, because it is a little bit, it's a little different. So if you have built an agent, okay, that was the one thing I wasn't going to talk. I guess we could say this was going to be a different format, and we ended up taking a different route. But one of the things I was going to discuss were a couple of things that had changed since the last time I had kind of given one of these webinar things. And one which has been around for a very long time, but is now very easy for the average bear, is retrieval augmented generation. So what retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, does, and that's what Notebook LM is going to do for you if you only ask it to use the sources you upload. So let me clarify. The way Notebook LM works is it actually does have a quote unquote traditional language model built in. So you can ask it whatever you want. But if you're using Notebook LM the way that it was originally intended anyway, it's supposed to be kind of a walled garden. It's supposed to be, yeah, I like the walled garden's the best way I think to put it. So it's only the stuff that you want to ask about. That's the only things it'll reference if you want. And that retrieval process is supposed to make it so, for instance, you're only looking at the quality peer-reviewed secondary sources you want to look at. So RAG can be incredibly useful for the historian. And what you can do, this was also something I wasn't going to discuss, but I might as well mention it quickly. There's a whole world out there of open source, CC BY or Creative Commons licensing, open source documents that you can even reproduce commercially if you want. They're peer reviewed, they're not paywalled, and you can simulate a paywalled world using the open web. But again, you have to know what you're looking at. So in the JSTOR example, why that's a little bit safer. Yeah, you have stuff from Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the 19th century where she's saying awful things. Yes, that's true. But that's in the JSTOR database already, and that's for effectively a primary source for us. But if you're researching, say, the English Civil War, and you're on JSTOR, that retrieval tool is only going to find stuff for you that's in JSTOR's holdings. Whether or not your school library or your personal subscription has access to that is another question, and it's another huge problem. JSTOR subscriptions are incredibly expensive. So I mentioned the open source movement for a reason there. And there's a whole class of models that are open source and free, and they're not proprietary. They're not quite the frontier models that we all like to use. They're not quite as good. Some of them are, though. And there is a problem with them, though. And that is the safety. So where I do find this helpful with the JSTOR example is you know that the information you're getting is at least past the JSTOR litmus test, okay? And for someone learning history or someone who's not that familiar with the past, that's a good way to keep some safety guardrails on. So yeah, I think the JSTOR tool is very effective. I don't have any. Once it leaves beta, if it hasn't left beta already, they'll iron out the wrinkles that I have some concerns with there. But the other thing that's changed, and I had alluded to this, is web grounded searches. So web grounding is Perplexity is another example like this, but Gemini does this, ChatGPT does this. Claude does this, Llama does, they all do it, okay? Even DeepSeek, if you want to go the other direction. What that will do is instead of searching a static data set, it'll also augment, again, that word. It's a static data set with a date cutoff. Let's say the date cutoff is January 2026. Anything after January 2026, that model doesn't know existed. It'll say, I'm not aware of that. So with web search now, it's adding back in that concern that we had with first generation language models, which I have talked about, and I'll never stop quoting this paper because I think it's really important. The stochastic parrots paper and the idea of encoding hegemonic biases. So, if you're going back to adding web-based results into a language model query, you might be getting maybe not disinformation, but you might be getting bad information. And that could be very confusing, whether it be a student or, someone who just wants to learn about an upcoming election, So tools have gotten, and there are other new tools as well, but those seem to be where I'm seeing more and more of your average Joe, so to speak, or Jolene, find more utility from a language model. So they have gotten better, but they've also gotten worse in some respects. And I'm sure engineers from every major frontier AI lab, they'd be like, okay, fine. All right. They might take issue with what I'm saying in specificity, but in terms of the broad picture, it's a bit of up and down. It really is. So these grounded searches, they do have a pretty high hallucination rate, a lower fabrication rate, but we'll get to a place one day where those statistics, those data points will go down to 5 and 10%. So go from 20 to 60 down to 5%, and that will be great. But how are we going to get there? And one of the things we never talk about behind the scenes are all the humans around the world working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to train models, and then to retrain models, and to fine-tune the models, and to give the models feedback, and to feed data created by humans into the models. So none of these models can exist without humans. None of them. And will we get to a place where a model can train itself completely? Yes. Are we there yet? No. So right now, you must verify every darn thing. You must do it. Every single time, you must verify. Every time. But the problem is, it sounds so convincing. It sounds so accurate. They're trotting out authors, and you've heard of these authors before, and you're like, yeah, I'm done. But then your teacher who actually looks, they're like, you made half of this up. So it's a bit of, it's not a 2 steps forward, 1 step back situation, but it kind of feels like that sometimes.
Yeah, we haven't really progressed beyond that core problem. When ChatGPT first kind of came to the public consciousness back in, what was that, 2022-ish?
Mm-hmm. Late in the year,
I led a webinar type thing for a bunch of faculty at SNHU where I was talking about kind of what is this thing and what is the problem with it. Why are scholars so concerned about it? And way back then, it was doing the exact same thing it's still doing now, where I put in a prompt, something about Frederick Douglass being an activist kind of using some of those anachronistic terms like you were talking about. And it came back with the most amazing quote from Frederick Douglass about that directly answered the question that I asked it.
Let me guess.
I asked, where did it come from? And it said, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And I'm like, I've read that book probably 15 times since I used to assign that book to every student as in my intro to U.S. history course as their kind of their primary source. And it's not in there, and it certainly wasn't. So it still does, it still makes stuff up because, again, it's trying to make me happy. Is trying to make the user happy. And that quote made me happy as a user, but it wasn't true. And so we still got that same problem that we've had all along.
One of the points I mentioned to you in passing earlier, I've been playing around with a new tool. I believe it's Singaporean in origin. It's called Manus, and Meta acquired it. And I was curious, it has a slide deck generation capability that's impressive. Now, a slide deck about 10 to 12 slides using its max mode takes about 20 minutes. That's a long time. That's longer than a Google Deep Think search on its ultra tier. It takes a very long time. Gamma, by contrast, for example, will create a slide deck in, 45 to maybe 50 seconds. So I'm using this Manus software, and it's relying on Llama, which is Meta's open source model. It's probably Meta has its problems, and I'm not here to talk about any company or disparage any company, but I usually avoid Meta tools. I just do. I'm very encouraged that they're still participating in the open source movement and open weight models and how we can tune our own versions of Llama. But I asked it, and I was like, I want to include these data points about hallucinations and fabrications. My research, okay? I have the sources. I actually was going to share them with everybody. Manis said, "Yes, I'm confident." And I said, "What's your degree of confidence?" It said 100%. I'm like, "No." And I asked again, and I said, "I can't find," like you were saying with the Frederick Douglass quote. I was like, "I can't find this in that study. I looked everywhere. I've done Control F keyword searches. I'm not pushing Control F again." And it goes, "Oh my gosh," in its own way. You're right. That doesn't exist. And then it says in the typical, large language model fashion, the irony of the fact that a hallucination about a hallucination on this slide. I was like, yeah, that still doesn't excuse it, So it's like, I'm so sorry I screwed everything up. Well, it's like, yeah, imagine if that is, forget history. Imagine that is a Department of Defense situation where it's a life or death choice between you deploying a weapon against somebody or not, and it says, yeah, I'm sure it's a person, on the other side, and ends up being one of ours, or ends up being a civilian. So, are we going too fast with this stuff? That's a big question. And if we slowed down, would that help everybody kind of calibrate and get caught up? Yeah, but again, countries like China won't slow down. So what do we do? This is not just about history anymore, and it never really was. And always with when we talked about generative AI, when we talked about language models and multimodal AI, using images and things like that, you know, there always has been this concern about things like autonomous robots, and that actually used to be the main reason that people got scared of AI. Now it's the other way around. Now I'm seeing more fear generated, no pun intended, from things like LLMs than I am from, say, autonomous weapon systems. So it's like we've kind of inverted the whole situation. It really used to be Congress. I studied this pretty extensively for a long time. People in Congress, they were worried about killer robots. They weren't worried about something that could generate text. Now look what's happening, and with predictive markets and robo trading, and it's just getting to be so intense. It feels like everything's just accelerating so quickly, and we've again seen this before. No, it's not Luddism. It's not Luddism. Excuse me. It's not machine breaking. It's not the assembly line. It's something fundamentally different. But we also don't know where this is going. And I think that's probably the biggest existential problem we have here is we simply don't know. So we don't know what this is going to do to history. We don't know what this is going to do to, say, computer science. But what's interesting now is I would feel more comfortable guiding someone through the history process than I would through, say, the data analytics side of things now. And that is an inversion as well that I did not think would ever happen. So the STEM push, I supported the STEM push pretty much my whole life. It should have been the whole time STEM plus humanities. And sure, hindsight, all that, but we did goof a little bit there. No one's to blame, but we put scientific and technological progress ahead of other things, which again, I supported wholeheartedly. Well, maybe not wholeheartedly, but now it was very clear we needed much more of a balance. And I don't think we had that balance. And it is coming back to get us now.
So with the existentialism and all of that kind of hovering above us, we still have to, plug along. We still have to forge ahead and all of that. And so you mentioned that you've got some tools for how we as historians can kind of navigate this new reality. You talked a little bit, I believe one of them was the RAG that you were talking
Yeah.
about with Notebook LM, but you mentioned a couple other tools too. So let's talk about what can historians do to kind of navigate and, possibly even prosper in this new world we live in.
Well, it does come down to prompting. It always is about how can I get the most out of a language model. So, for instance, I brought up the Civil War, English Civil War before. Usually, a student, or not even a student, they have to write a paper on, say, the rise of Oliver Cromwell. I don't know, something like that. Um, they might start with something along the lines of, why did the English Civil War happen? You'll get a summary, you'll get output. But if you don't follow up, you got nothing really. You have just a very basic answer. But if you said, what are the major historiographical debates regarding the economic causes of the English Civil War since 2000, identify key scholars in their respective positions, now you've pushed the model to think more like a graduate student and less like, say, an undergraduate or a high school student. And then if you followed up with specific questions about the scholars, that were mentioned, you could get sources, you could get ideas, and you might very well have a breakthrough that you didn't have without the language model. So, for instance, there's other things you can do. Some of these things are baked into models, but they don't necessarily always get what we might say activated. So, for example, chain of thought reasoning. You would explain step by step. I need you to do this. Then I need you to do this. Then I need you to do this. Then, after you've completed all those steps, I need you to give me output that answers this specific question or set of questions. So, chain of thought, you would be coaching the model through its process, and you would be steering it. And in many ways, as a human, you would be in charge. Another way that I find language models to be very helpful for me, and this would go for digital humanities and digital historians, and this would be very helpful for public historians, is, let's say you do have, say, really scattered records of, I don't know, what would be something simple. Civil War veterans from Virginia. I have, enlistment rolls, and I need to make it so these are organized and legible. I'm having trouble reading this. Using something like OCR and then organizing it into an Excel or CSV type file, you would save yourself a lot of time. Now, one of the biggest problems I have as a historian reading old documents is the handwriting. Ironically, handwriting of students today, mine's no better, might be worse than some. They used to be beautiful penmanship, but I have trouble reading it. So, using digitization tools and using scanning tools, you can then create beautiful databases that are keyword searchable, and that is wonderfully time saving and accuracy increasing. What I find language models to be most helpful for, in this set of points, though, is I had mentioned the sycophancy problem. And I see this with every major frontier model and every major open weight model. There's that tendency to say, great idea, that's really spot on. You're brilliant, wow, that's impressive. Say, I don't want you to be a sycophant. Tell me the truth. What do you see in my thesis statement? How can I make it better? Be the biggest critic of my work that you possibly can be. Tear me apart if you want to go that far. And then what the model will do is it'll still be trying to please you, but it's now going to please you by acting oppositionally and adversarially. And another way you can this is just straight up prompting, just using a regular language model, grounded, non-grounded, doesn't matter. Then you could say, I didn't really think that this section of your output was developed enough. Add more. add more specifics, add some sources, confirm the source's accuracy, and double check. Okay. Now, that might not give you everything you want, but you could also say, focus on perspectives, again, avoiding that sycophancy, that act as a dissenting voice compared to the consensus we've seen developed in other parts of your output. Now, if you notice, in each of these examples that I've just given, and there are actually some others we could come up with, it means multi-turn conversations. And what I've begun requiring of my classes quite a long time ago is, if there is the goal of using language model output for a history paper, philosophy paper, political science paper, I need to see you have at least a 3-turn conversation. And what we mean by turn, just to remind everyone, is initial prompt, model response, follow-up prompt, model follow-up response, third time around. Okay. Now, when you get to around 10 turns or so, you can start to see major problems with a lot of the models. But between like 3 and 7, 8 turns, you're still going to be within the realm of pretty accurate output. Now, there are some concerns here. The longer you have a model conversation, the more energy you're using from servers and the more polluting it is. And I acknowledge that sometimes when I am using models, I actually start to think how much damage I'm doing to the natural world just through this process. But it also comes back to that concern or question, am I the one that needs to focus on recycling, or should it be Coca-Cola? Am I the one that's supposed to be figuring out solutions to the pollution generated by these massive data centers, or is it, Alphabet's problem? Is it the government's problem? And, the guilt is a tricky issue. But this applies to so many things in life. But again, to stay kind of on topic, at least a little bit, it does require multi-turn back and forths. And it's not, and I mentioned this previously, and I think I'll probably have to mention this for even quite a few years in the future. These aren't search engines where you just say, weather Dallas. You say, in the case here, what are the barometric pressure changes or patterns that you can identify in Dallas over the last 6 months? Provide me with a chart or table that clearly graphs this phenomenon for me, right? And then you get a beautiful visualization of that output instead of just, having to look at a bunch of numbers. So remember also that a lot of models can create things like infographics for you. They can create charts. They can create slides. They can do a lot of things for you, but you have to practice with them. You have to open up whatever model you like. And it is helpful to become sort of familiar with one. Each writes differently, but they all have the same basic functionality, but they each have their little quirks. Like, I can tell OpenAI's writing, I can tell Anthropic's writing, I can tell Alphabet or Google's writing, I can tell Meta's writing. And that only comes from experience. And I know which models I like for certain problems and certain things. And I go to that model for that problem. But how do you get there? This wasn't, a college degree. This is hands on the ground, hands on the keyboard, I guess you should say, and just practicing and practicing and practicing. And you have to be willing to put in the time. And if you're not willing to put in the time, that's where we do have to start having the discussion. Are you going to be replaced by somebody who did put in that time, who did take those online courses, those massive, those MOOCs, right? That's where I think people are being left behind, is that it's overwhelming. You open these language model interfaces, you're hit with this thing, you don't know how to use it. Just play around, put some words in there, see what it says. And if you don't agree with it, notice what your prompt said, try to change your prompt. If you change your prompt, you get better output. It's a trial and error situation. It is. Now there are guides. I could certainly share prompting guides. There's all sorts of guides, but the best way to do it is by doing. And that's what I suggest to everybody, regardless of your profession, discipline, what have you. It doesn't matter what method you're using, you have to perfect it. And you have to learn how to make the model work for you. Now, what doesn't work for students listening? Saying to the model, write like a student, that does not work like you think it does. And there are these models out there that supposedly make language model output more human-like. It's still very transparent. You can still see the digital dust remnants of language model output in there. And you should be aware of that. And those other tricks like using language translation back and forth, that doesn't always really work either. But guess what? Our detection tools are terrible. So it actually is coming down now to humans and quote unquote catching a student in a language model misattribution or non-permissible case is very, very labor intensive. And I think that's part of the reason why some students are getting away with these shortcuts is because it's not that their teachers don't care. It's not that their teachers don't see it. It's just so time consuming to go through that process exhaustively to prove conclusively that language models have been misused. So practice is imperative for both teachers and for students. And yes, I've seen some students working with me. A student said to me, "How can I actually use a language model to get away with tricking my teachers?" I said, "I absolutely won't teach you that. But what I will teach you to do is how to use a model so it writes more like a human for you. But that's still dishonest if you don't disclose, So this is also where we get into that slippery slope situation where I teach a student how to be more digitally literate or more AI literate. And what are they going to do? They're going to turn around and use that to take advantage of people who are not paying attention. So will that type of student who is really paying attention to learning how to manipulate language models be in a better place after graduation? That's a really complicated question. And I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. I don't like saying yes there, but I don't know. When it comes to daily workflows in the corporate world and elsewhere, having mastery of, say, an agent and having the ability to deploy an agent to do what you need to do versus someone who's still doing, rote tasks manually. Yeah, you're gonna be ahead of them, So this applies to everything, history and otherwise. And I'm just rambling on now, so I'll shut up. But
not a problem. So I think maybe the last kind of topic that we should touch on tonight here, and then we can, this will be an ongoing conversation. So perhaps since we're coming up on an hour or so of discussion here, you mentioned the things that machines cannot do, and so. You've identified some of the tools that historians can use to kind of hopefully succeed. We've talked about what the machines can do, but what can't they do, and what does that mean for historians?
They don't write well. That's key. Okay, they write structured, logical, and convincing output, but they don't write well. They fall into these patterns, and you can break the patterns, but then they regress right back to those patterns. So in terms of just actual language model use, because that's what we're most focusing on in this discussion, we haven't really talked most about multimodal and things like that. We haven't talked about self-driving cars or anything along those lines either. But by the way, they're in Philly now, and it's so jarring seeing Waymo in Philly. Anyway, it's very, very, very strange, right? It really is. I know the data. It's safer, but it's still just very strange, you know. I also like driving, but um, machines can't make those determinations. I think in terms of life or death in warfare situations. Just to mention something besides for language models, but in terms of academic issues, I do think the biggest barrier right now is the original voice of each individual human. And there are some historians who are brilliant who I struggle to read their work. And then there are some historians who write beautifully and have very basic ideas, and they both have advantages for me as a reader, you know. But I do think that they are uncreative, unoriginal writers. Um, the other thing I do think that a model is bad at is empathy, a sense of truly understanding what it is to be human, what it is. Another example I had somewhere around here um, was, you know, reading that letter from, say, the French government to a mother that both of her sons had died in a particular battle. The language model could say, what a terrible tragedy, what a terrible loss, how sad. But the human can feel it. And I think that really does matter. And I think that does come across in scholarship more effectively, more impactfully when it is generated by a human. I think that machines are not wonderful at generating novel forms of analysis. It's, again, typically synthetic. I have been able to tease out of a model something that impressed me significantly with its eloquence and its sense of humanity and its originality, but it takes such effort for it to happen. Um, it can't it can't understand what it's like to have a bad day, and it can't understand what it is to get tired. It can't understand what it is to feel that burnout at the end of finals. It can't. Every time you open your language model interface, let's get going. How I don't want to get going. It's raining and I just want to lie in bed today. You know, that type. It doesn't get it, right? Things like that. And I really do feel that those are the things that are potentially subjective in history, and that's a problem, most certainly. Um, so I do think that the augmentation component here, the objective capabilities of a model with the subjective tendencies of a human, if you could fuse those together, you get this. I can't believe I'm going to say this, but man-machine symbiosis almost, right? You get a little bit of the machine, a little bit of humanity, and you start to fuse them together. You know, I don't mean going as far as having an actual machine implanted or anything like that, but we're already heading in that direction too, by the way. One of the craziest things I saw, and this is going back decades now, but it actually finally is a breakthrough in terms of consciousness, since this gets wrapped up with language models a lot. It's one of my favorite areas of philosophy, and I'm now working on multiple projects in this regard. Questions of consciousness and AI. Again, one of the oldest questions. I have a book on my bookshelf from the 1960s. Can machines think? You know, and if you notice, this idea of neural nets is still around. Originally, neural nets were the idea of mapping the human brain's neurons and creating machines that basically emulated that, right? So the concept is still very much with us. But the ability of a implant to take over another person's brain for someone who is mobility impaired and have that person still be conscious of themselves, yet being taken over physically by the person who can't move and having their hands move and manipulate objects, it's unbelievable. So there's so many things that could happen if we are in the loop. But if we're out of the loop, I don't think that we're even remotely there yet. Now, is there some frontier model that exists that can do everything that I'm saying can't be happening? Yes, I bet you there probably is. Is it any time ready for deploying to the general public? No, I do not think so. So I think that for quite some time, if you are behind the curve in terms of your own knowledge of how to utilize a language model, there still is some time to catch up, but I think that window is closing very, very quickly. And I think that people do have to make a choice. Are they going to, is this the hill? Is this the hill they're willing to, I don't mean this literally, but is this the hill they're going to die on? And that's a choice that I can't make for anybody but myself. And the people that I know who have brought in AI into their teaching in an honest and creative way are able to tease things out of the machines that the machines can't do by themselves and they can't do themselves. So there is that symbiotic relationship that is possible. But I think the key thing right now, in terms of what the machines can't do, is be human. And I think that's a big deal. I really do.
Thank you for taking the time to talk to me. It was a lot of fun.
Sure.
And thank you all for listening. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast or any of our other podcasts, please write to workinghistorians@gmail.com. This episode appears on the Working Historians podcast feed, and you can subscribe to that feed on any podcast app, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Podbean, Amazon Music, Pandora, or whatever else you prefer. That way you won't miss any episodes, and you'll continue to hear about all the other cool stuff that historians do with their lives. As always, this podcast does not represent the views of Southern New Hampshire University. For Matt Schandler, I'm Rob Denning. Be good to yourselves and each other.